It was enough. You should just be working on it. Don't take a break on and off, you know.
Yeah, don't let you do this.
Number two is the best question in the whole paper. I can get them. Yes. Number two is the best question. Number one is the problem. Yeah, but you have to create your own this radio system. Like, I don't even know where I got that. So it's not because you really have to look at the
Are you all giving entities any idea of what their risk assessment should look like to the Compliance Commission? I had a question from a law firm that is small. They were glad to see that there's guidance at different tiers, so you don't have to do all that stuff, but their concern is the risk assessment. Are they supposed to do a self-assessment? That's what they have a question, because of course, you know, most people have never done it. Okay. Oh, but y'all love a template. You know, well, we need to talk about that after, because that sounds like that's a big concern, and it shouldn't be. They don't know where to go. So, today we are doing the unit on policy, that's unit 13. Last time we met, I did the culture and training, which is unit 14, and I said we were going to do this one last. Unit 13, at least of the modules I'm covering. And then at the end of this, this shouldn't be long today, and then at the end of this we will talk about the question. I did some slides on the question to, based on what I saw in terms of possible questions you should be answering an approach. So today we're talking about policy and procedures and the things that should be included, considered, as well as the communication and the design of the policy. So the first thing is, when we're formulating a policy, it has to be risk-based. Because, and I'm sure most of you have seen policies in companies, institutions, and you can't put everything in there. Sometimes people feel like, well, we can't tell common sense how to prevail, and I just can't tell someone move the paper from here to there, sign it in this block, and all the steps. So, because we can't put every single action, activity in the policy, it needs to be risk-based as to what is most critical and the areas where we cannot make mistakes. So when we start off with policy, we have to take a strategic approach. And when you think about strategy and the strategic plan, that is executive management. So that's why it starts off, it must be approved by the most senior level so that you could have buy-in, so that everyone from top to bottom is on board. Of course, it should be clear, user-friendly, so anyone could read it. It shouldn't be so complicated that if the person who is front the reception or the messenger, everyone should be able to read it and understand what is being communicated. It should be internally and externally communicated, and this is a new thing for a lot of companies, the external communication. Whenever you get inspections now, they ask you to provide policy. They might not ask you to provide the whole policy, but they want to see selected pieces, definitely customer due diligence procedures, AML, CFT prevention activities, programs. They will see all of that. They will see in policy that you're communicating certain things, and they ask you to show them in policy, because most policy today is soft copy, not hard. And so oftentimes you have to externally communicate your policy and indicate as well that it has been approved by management. I have dealt with correspondent banks that want to see your policy with regard to customer due diligence, to make sure that if they deal with you, you have the structures in place. It also indicates effective corporate governance. And I could say this because this is publicly known. If you look in Commonwealth Bank annual report, they have about 2 or 3 pages just talking about governance, talking about policy, talking about risk-based policy, talking about who does what, internal audit committee, the internal auditor, plus the compliance. That is done to indicate the corporate governance structure, and also that there are policies in place to make sure the mandate of the board, the mandate of the shareholders is executed. So most companies now, and we actually, when I was there, we did this comparison because we were communicating to the board how the environment has changed, because they asked, well, why we have to all these disclosures. Before, you will have a annual report that might have been 10 pages. The last one I was involved with them when I was there, that is 2 years ago, it was 80 pages. And we said, like, who's reading this? But for regulatory purposes, for effective governance, you have to put everything in there. And the MLRO should be promoting and be part of the formulation of the strategy and the policy. So at the end of the day, we want to protect the business against money laundering and terrorism financing. That's the bottom line. If you look at any policy, procedure, what the plan is, what is the point? To protect the business against money laundering and terrorism financing. Whether it happens or not, we are in protection mode. So if I have this building, I will protect it against a hurricane. I don't know if a hurricane coming, but I know we have shutters inside one of the rooms. We have a disaster recovery plan. We know that if a hurricane was about to hit, we know the room everyone should go into. If we happen to be in the building, we know that we're supposed to get plastic to cover all the electronic equipment. It has to be plugged out, put in a secure area. I'm sure most people who work in a company that has that structure knows that, and that is prevention. That doesn't mean it's going to happen. You have a contact person, staff know who, this is who you call if a hurricane passes to say I could come to work, who I can't come to work, you have an emergency team. Likewise, for AML, CTF, you need to have that same kind of plan, because the same sort of dangers exist that one person get in will destroy your company. So a hurricane could destroy a physical building, a money launderer could destroy your business. Same impact. Okay, so again, the policy is there, the procedures are there to provide the infrastructure and structure to protect us. So FATF recommendation 18, and this is in your material, says, this is their recommendation now, says that institutions should be required to implement programs against money laundering, terrorism financing. They should be required to implement group-wide programs, and that should include policies and procedures for sharing information within a group. Okay, so they speak into group-wide situations, international companies in particular. So notice all where they said required. So if you go to Financial Transaction Reporting Act, you can see where we are requiring certain things in there. We require, in terms of AML and terrorism financing, certain things should be communicated. There are requirements as to what should be seen in policy. So we have adopted the spirit of a lot of this in our legislation to make sure that there is no doubt what you need to be doing. Okay? So just looking at the group-wide structure, some of the key elements when you're looking at group-wide policy, procedures, the ongoing employee training program, what does that look like? I have a slide that just speaks to training towards the end, but group-wide, there should be some consistency. There should be something documented. The independent audit function, so if there is an audit function, because some entities are very small, the independent audit function is sometimes outsourced. It's not within the company. But be that as it may, they should be testing the program to make sure that what you say in your policy, that actually happens. So when I was a part of the independent audit function, we used to take the policy and it says they are supposed to review customers. If a customer has these characteristics, it should be escalated. We test customers where they escalated. And we do tests where we test from the end, so that means a customer that's onboarded to see if everything was done correctly, assessed correctly, like your question. And so when I looked at the question as assigned, I took it from the approach, even like an auditor, that if I reviewed this, am I satisfied that the evaluation was done properly in the first place? You start as the policy, first place. So, audit function is always important to test. Does that thing work? As well as sitting with staff and saying, okay, when you get a customer, suppose they present like this, what do you do? And if the staff member doesn't say, if they say, well, I'm not sure, if they say, I'm not sure, I just ask my supervisor, that's the wrong answer. Because you should be looking in the policy. And if the policy doesn't address it, then the policy has a gap. Okay? So, important to test to make sure it works. The other reason it's important to test is because you want to see if the policy is actually effective. I've seen a lot of policy that's pretty and it looks good and it sounds good, but it's not practical and it's not effective. And stuff happens and people say, well, why did that happen? We have policy, but the policy is not effective. It didn't take into account some elements of the process. So you really have to test it to make sure that what we want to happen, the actual intention of the policy is what is occurring. So if the intention is to prevent money laundering, prevent terrorism financing, will that actually happen with the policy that we have in place? So I can't overemphasize how important testing is. And screening procedures for new hires. So again, this is a key element of group-wide. So you want to know that group-wide there's consistency, and anyone coming in, there's a certain threshold or standard across the group. So those of you who work in global companies know this is important, because and I always tell people this, because someone get through the door in the Bahamas or in Europe or like say France or Italy, that means they in the door in your global company. And in a month they could be transferred to the Bahamas. So if group-wide screening process is weak or the procedures are weak in Italy, then that person could invade your system and now they're in the Bahamas and they doing bad things. And there are a lot of people tell me, yeah, we have people who come from this place, that place, are doing bad things here. And you say, how did they get through? If they had to go through the procedure probably here, they wouldn't get into the company. But that is why group-wide you need to have strong screening procedures for in your policy. And the last thing is actual policies and procedures and controls against money laundering, terrorism, financing should be coordinated group-wide to ensure compliance, and we'll talk about this in the next slide as well, to ensure the minimum requirements are met in every jurisdiction and that they are not just adequate but robust enough to protect the company. So just going into that last point a little deeper, where you operate globally, you want to adopt also a group anti-money laundering policy. So you may have a local policy, but you should also have a group anti-money laundering policy. So when I worked morning at a Swiss entity, we had in the policy, it was written in this way, that these are all the Swiss ordinances to do with money laundering, terrorism financing, that group-wide we all had to comply with because the head is Switzerland. Then it had subsections that had the Bahamas, Singapore, Italy, France, the UK. So you had an understanding of what was required in these other jurisdictions at a minimum. And as it says in the second point, you would want to comply with the highest standard among the countries where your business operates. Now, the practicality of this sometimes is hard because people go into other jurisdictions for competitive reasons, because they know, well, in the UK they're gonna want blood. They're gonna check this, check that, do all this stuff. In the Bahamas, they don't ask that yet, so we want to stay in the Bahamas because we don't have to produce all these documents. Okay? And sometimes it's a competitive advantage why people are operating in a particular jurisdiction. I don't want to say they view it as a low fence, but unfortunately sometimes it's viewed as a low fence. So I have a lot of money. The Bahamas might be better because they a little slacker. You don't want that reputation. So amongst countries, often this what actually happens, they, like it says here, and this is from your material, you comply the highest standard, but what often happens, you have a meeting in the group and you say, what standard do we set that everyone could comply with? We don't necessarily have to go with the one that is the most extreme, but what would be acceptable given where our clients have accounts. And if a client is a global client, there may be restrictions on that client that they cannot be in a certain jurisdiction given the requirements. So you have in your case as well a client that is what I consider a global client, has multiple nationalities, and one of the countries is the US, which is always like minefield. So sometimes you can make a decision that we don't really want to have you in the US if you make the Bahamas your domicile country, or this is where you want to operate your business from, because we don't want to deal with them. Right? That's a decision, and that could be based on what standards are among countries. That we have a rule: if you are a global client, then you have to meet the global standards. If you are a client that's only in the Bahamas, then once you meet the Bahamas standard, we good. We're not going to make a Bahamian meet the standard of Switzerland or the UK or the US, because that don't make sense. And that's a real thing that's discussed locally I know at central bank level and all these regulatory agencies, because you have local banks like the Fidelities, the Commonwealth banks, that 99% of their customers are Bahamian. And you're talking about things like FATCA, they don't really care about that, because they may have less than 20 clients in the US. But a foreign bank like RBC gonna care about it because they have a lot of accounts to the US. Do we make Commonwealth Bank or have the expectation that they should meet a standard in the US? That's the question. You see? So that particular point there with complying with the highest standard, you really have to understand the business, who the clients are that you are dealing with globally. And sometimes you have to make decisions on where those clients could operate and put limits on them, that if you come here, you cannot do business in these other countries. And as it says, there's supplement group policy local considerations, so that's where I mentioned you have the head country and then you put all the local, considerations alongside, so you have both together. I just had a interesting conversation this week where the Bahamas is the head, but the other countries, the entities dealing with are like Japan and UK and Vietnam, and I'm like, it's very curious to me. You make the Bahamas the head, so what is it gonna mean for the group policy in terms of if in those countries the policy is higher? I think one is even Singapore, and I know Singapore in some respect is higher than us. So if you have a group-wide policy, do you make the Bahamas do what the other countries where it's higher put that standard in? So that's a very, that could be tricky. And I give you an example where it could be tricky that I experienced. In Singapore, if you suspect someone is money laundering and you have suspicion, you could close their account right away. In the Bahamas, you cannot do that. And not only close their account, you could call them in and say, I want to close your account because you are money laundering. Not you are money laundering, but we have suspicion. They could do it right away, and I experienced that. Now, the same client have an account in the Bahamas, but you don't want to say anything or alert them because that's tipping off. Okay? So, you have a situation where you can't even negotiate with Singapore because they already do it. They're not waiting on what you thinking. In their country, you go right away and you report. So you're doing damage control with this customer because now whatever money they had in Singapore is gone. Like they, here, go buy. Bahamas still have you, and maybe another country still have you, and you trying to make a decision what we can do. And here you waiting on FIU to tell you whether you could stay or go. No, right? This real thing happened. And we freaking out because we say suppose it's something and we are accused of tipping off. We trying to talk to the client in this particular way, and then someone call us and say, oh no, Singapore don't close the account. So, you know, the group compliance person telling us this, and like, you know, what do we do? So it's important even where you have local considerations to have a communication, and this is the last one, guidance on how we share information, how we notify entities, because you gotta know if I tell these group, this is what they can be required to do. And not that you withhold information, but you gotta be aware what our steps gonna be, because in their country they have to do this.
Okay, can I ask you?
Mm-hmm.
The fact that Singapore closes that account and we
Mhm.
have them as a client,
Mm-hmm.
we are still waiting on the decision from FI.
Mm-hmm. Which never came, like, because that's a real thing.
Okay, so in those circumstances,
Mhm.
is it then becomes mandatory that we then report and So
The
we
client
stop-
was reported, but reporting a client doesn't mean that you could exit them.
that's what I was thinking. Can
No,
we just-
you can't do it automatically. If you have a bank and trust, you can't. And Our retail banking sector does it all the time. They have the ability to do it. It is a different matter with private banking because you could have reputational issues. You could damage that client by doing that to them without grounds because our law does not protect you. So if they could determine that you have done reputational damage to them, you could have liability as well. There's nothing, once you enter a contract with a customer, it is in the investment banking space, private banking space, the customer also has a right to keep that account. Because I know of a case where, and this is where illegal activity was determined. It would involve a criminal matter, and this a family, and they put out a hit on somebody, and it was found out XYZ, and the institution tried to close the account. Right? They had the account frozen. Went to court here. The account was frozen. FIU, all that was involved, and the account was frozen. The family got a local attorney here to have that reversed and force the institution to retain their accounts because they did not have grounds to close it. And they had to operate this account although they didn't want to. So you could be put in a situation where I want to exit you, I have reason to exit you, enough suspicion, everything else, but in that private banking space, that's a little different. So the viewpoint is generally, and that's from a practical point of view, don't take somebody on if you are not comfortable. So again, I go back to your case that you have. If you have suspicions, if you have concerns, don't put them on your books because sometimes it is the hardest thing to take them off. Now, like I said, in the retail banking space, if you like RBC, Fidelity, all of them in our retail banking space, oh, that's all. They send you a letter, come for your money, and that's it. And I think from my understanding and legal opinions that I've seen, because I've seen in the private banking space getting legal opinion, what do we do, how do we proceed, versus retail, and in the retail banking space, in their agreements, because you know you sign your account opening, it gives them those rights to do that. Private banking space a little different, because you don't oftentimes have all those big documents. I've seen people open accounts on a handshake in private banking space. I mean, it's changed a lot now, but in the past, so imagine one of those accounts you had that was 20 years old, and the children took it over, and the children into stuff, which happens, which you don't have, unless you decide to go through all your accounts, which central bank encourage people to do, update these things, and that's why you update, not just update KYC, but if they didn't have these forms that we have now, make them sign it. Now, not everybody can do that, and it's not the easiest thing to tell a client that it's valued at 100 million. Yeah, you know, I want you to sign all this stuff. That's a different conversation, because you don't want to disrupt something that never had a problem or offend, because there are cultural things going on as well as relationship. So that could be challenging, and that is where you have to share information group wide. You have to communicate, because global clients have relationships, and the customer in the Bahamas might be 10 million, but that same client group wide may have 90 million, say in Switzerland. You can't disrupt the apple cart. You gotta be able to articulate, this is why, and thus and so, and this is what we have done, because they're not hearing you if you don't have something valid. You can't say, I think. So that's where the private banking space, I tell people that's a different whole ball game, and high net worth people operate very differently. And like I said, culture also comes into play. If you deal with someone from a Saudi country, you're not dealing with the prince or the family members directly. They have families set up that have passed on the tradition to be their representative. So they have someone who deals with financial, and that's a family. And the daddy was the person, and now the son take over. So they signing the documents, not the person. And that's culturally a different concept you got to deal with. So you have no idea. You have to be very delicate. So again, when I looked at your question, just from a practical point of view, and they said large institution, and you operate in multiple countries, you have to be sensitive to as well what you could obtain. Like they say, what documents could you obtain to satisfy yourself? It might not be that simple. Sometimes you have to take that trip, and like the thing said, you have a farm, go see it. Actually visit it. Because, I mean, I've seen people do that. They jump on the plane and they go, I come in to see your operation.
Even locally, we have issues in the law, asking and requesting of certain information, because clients be like, well, I only done a litigation or whatever. What this information necessary for?
But see, the other thing is confidentiality and privacy. And again, in Latin American countries, there is the threat of kidnapping, different extortion things happen. And that is real threat for them. At the institution I worked for, when they went to Mexico, they never left the hotel. The client had to come to them. And the client came with security because they didn't want any of the staff to be subject to any type of threat or anything happen to them, because people are watching. So sometimes it could be practically difficult, and to be able to say, I want you to give me this or give me that, especially with inheritance, because there might not be documents, that are easily available. Not everyone have a land registry. You deal with that in the Bahamas, right? That's a big problem. So, again, that's, I'm sure that's why they gave you that question. It's not simple. So, what do we actually consider when we formulating a policy? And luckily for most businesses now, because most businesses are very mature, there is something that's in place. But whether you have an existing policy or whether you're doing it from scratch, the nature, scale, complexity of the business is important to consider when you are formulating the policy. I can't use the policy if I am a private bank and my private bank only does trust, and we only have 8 people, and our client base is 200 clients. I can't use that policy for an entity that has over 10,000 clients and has multiple products and does trading, does their own banking, custody, as well as operating multiple countries. We can't use the same policy, right? Because the scale, the nature, complexity is very different. Diversity of business. So how many different types of businesses are you in? What type of things do you do? Will also impact the policy, and the focus here, of course, is AML, CTF prevention. So that matters, because how you deliver products to customers. So if we sell investment products, if we do fund administration, if we do family office, if we do legal work, we do land sales and personal, what I call personal care. I put in that word. There are banks that will pick you up from the airport, have your jewelry in the safe, take care of paying your staff. If you have a home in the Bahamas, they do all of that. It makes a difference because you may become aware of something that the customer is doing just through those interactions. Volume and size of transactions, of course, is different if the average customer balance is 10,000 versus someone who is 50 million, 100 million, and then the risk areas of the operation. Policy should specifically target those risk areas so that you focus on what could bring you down and what are hotspots for your entity. And these will also be highlighted by the regulator, because in our legislation, and I know in central bank guidelines, they talk about risk areas of operation, people who are client facing, people who deal with cash type transactions, relationship managers, they also speak to. So our regulator tells us as well what are the risk areas, and then we know from understanding our business what also globally are risk areas, because these things are documented and talked about in other guidance and legislation. So some things that we would need to consider when we're actually sitting down and putting policy together, or looking at our policy and determining if it is adequate. So our policy at the minimum should be able to achieve certain things. And this what I call is the checklist. If I was reviewing someone's policy, and I know we have persons here from the regulatory bodies as well, and to me this is their checklist that they look at when they say, your policy, does it meet these requirements? Is it compliant with regulations and laws? Does it comply, right? That's an easy, you doing it or you're not.
So sorry.
Is it written in a way that it encourages cooperation with law enforcement and investigating authorities? Does it actually speak to that? If we have a suspicious transaction, this is the flow, this is when you contact the police, this is when you contact the FIU, and what that should look like, and we should comply fully with the law. Some institutions actually attach the relevant legislation and regulations in their policy as a reference, or they'll take excerpts to also emphasize this is what the cooperation should look like. Excuse me. Policy should also talk about protecting customer confidentiality. So not because someone asks you for information, you share all, even what they didn't ask for. I always say the persons, and most legal persons to tell you if they ask for this little thing here, that's all you give them. Don't give them nothing else. They have to be very specific. All my attorney friends tell me, they ask for that. Be specific, and you need to be precise. So when you respond, you're responding as precisely. You ask for thus and so, and that is what I gave you. Now, I might have other things I could give you, but you didn't ask for it. Okay? So you have to be careful, because this is where confidentiality comes into play. And if it's not pertinent, as well as if it is not relevant to the matter, it's nothing illegal, you don't have the obligation to share it. And this is where the U.S. getting problems with the Bahamas, because they don't like the fact that they have to go through our legal process, and they have to make a request, and they can't go on a fishing expedition and say, okay, I just want information about this client. They have to be specific, and they have to go through our agencies to get that information. And if they are not specific enough, then they normally have a problem. But they don't necessarily like that process, because I'm sure in other countries they could just say, give me the file, and they get the file. they could look and say, oh, I didn't know you was doing this too, and I didn't know this person was related to you, and that is not relevant to the matter. And that's why you really have to protect the customer. It also should, at minimum, define roles, responsibilities, accountabilities. So everyone should know who the MLRO is. Everyone should know who the backup is. That should be documented in policy. And it should also be documented what the process is, what their responsibilities. This is the person who you report suspicious transaction to. This is when you report it. This is their responsibility. Once they report it to you, they have to acknowledge that they got this information from you. And in some policies of companies, they even have it where that they have to come back to you and tell you what happened to the matter. Now, a lot of policies don't have that, but some do. So that if I make a report, they come back to me and say, that report you made, it was passed on, nothing came out of it, just so you're aware. Statement of corporate commitment to AML, CFT, resources, acceptable behavior. So in a lot of policy, it starts off sometimes with a statement from the president, managing director, group head that says, we are not, we do not support money laundering, dealing with criminal entities, XYZ. We support the compliance culture in place. We support the laws, da da da. And you normally have that statement, and that's what they're speaking to. We will not tolerate any behavior that supports money laundering or terrorism financing. So normally in policy you will have some sort of statement like that at the beginning to say this is the company's position, this is what we stand for, this is who we are. Minimum, again, at a minimum you should have customer due diligence procedures, documented what we do when we accept a client, how we monitor, and risk assessment. I think every regulator is expecting you to have that, and they're asking for that in particular. So I'd be very shocked if a entity didn't have at least that. Don't care the size, scale, at least speaking to that element of your policy. Education, training, and awareness and approach. So policy should also speak to that everyone should receive training and when the training would occur, and in some cases, some companies, they have training where you have to pass an exam at the end of the year annually, like for a refresher, and you have to make an 80% grade, and they'll even have that in policy. And they'll say all the policies you should be reviewing, and we will be testing compliance from time to time. And of course SDR reporting, so that should be included in policy. So if someone says they have AML CFT policy, this would be like a checklist to say, does it have these elements? And of course, this is the minimum, so you should have above this, but at minimum, these things should be in place. So, going deeper into the policy, so we talked about the policy should start from the top, and you should have the approval of the board. Things you should consider when you're formulating it, as well as the minimum things that should be achieved through the policy. So now looking at the actual content of it, it should somewhere in that policy talk about risk and how the procedures that lie within this policy or follow the company's approach to mitigate the risk of money laundering and terrorism financing. And like it says, a summary, so you're not going into the whole company's method and thinking, you just giving a summary that, and normally when you see in policies, normally like a paragraph or two that says, this is our response to the risks we face from money laundering and operating in this sector, XYZ. It should also, and the last slide we spoke about this, responsibilities of specific persons and functions. So normally it says the money laundering reporting officer, who it is, what their responsibility. Compliance, who it is, what their responsibility. Compliance department, if there's one, responsibility and accountability is. Sometimes they'll put internal audit in there because they will test responsibility and accountability, and then the audit committee if there is a board structure in place. If you have a group structure, it'll talk about the head of group compliance, and it'll also talk about the group structure. So in terms of the persons and functions, that's how detailed in a lot of cases you need to be. There should be procedures, of course, identification and monitoring checks, which should be risk-based. So what is our approach to identification and monitoring checks? So some of this is in your case as well. So you have the case, and one of the things I asked when I looked at the case, if I was doing a review, I'd say, where's the policy and what does it say? What are the requirements for our company? Because that might be a gap we have, or it might be quite detailed and we could articulate this is what our requirements are when someone is initially considered to be a client for our business. I can't remember if that person in the initial interview even had to provide identification. See? So that is, again, you have multiple nationalities, so I don't want to preempt my slides with that, but that's one of my questions, which one you using? Because you're going to have a primary that you use where you actually live. And then also in the content, monitoring checks over staff compliance with policy and procedures. So how do we monitor that people actually complying with this policy that we've written, documented? We also need to have in the policy what will be done and the frequency of the testing and review. So people have the expectation and they're aware. You have the policy, don't think we're not going to check you. And we're going to let you know we're checking you. And we may let you know that can be random. And at any point, you might be reviewed to confirm that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Some persons go as far as to put it in performance appraisals. I've seen performance appraisals that you could get negative points if you don't complete required training. You get negative points if you get any infractions from compliance for procedures or policy that are put in place, and they could be negative points against your overall score on your appraisal. So I've seen that. That's how far some companies will go, and they really not playing with it. So just going into the responsibilities and accountabilities a bit deeper. So one of the things by detailing these roles and accountability is we are able to demonstrate to our regulator that we have good corporate governance, that the tone from the top is saying we are serious and we are making it clear and precise that all these areas are accounted for, and we clearly document who is doing what and who is responsible at the end of the day. So you have here the board and senior management. So if you look at most annual reports today, they talk about the board and senior management and their responsibility specifically to AML-CTF. So you look in any of the annual reports now, they detail it, and they talk about if they have a committee specifically assigned, like a risk committee or an internal audit committee, they will say they have oversight over this particular area. They'll actually say that. The policy should speak about, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago, the compliance officer, MLRO, the people in that team, the senior management, any deputies. It's important because some units are small, so if you only have a compliance and MLRO, you need to know about two of them went to training today or they go on a training trip. If we have a problem, who's dealing with it? And sometimes that could be tricky because that's when things happen. So the policy should say who is responsible in their absence. Supervisors and other management levels, they also have responsibility for AML CTF, so within their relative units. And I know when I was in the retail banking sector, how this worked was at regular staff meetings, the branches would have staff meetings, and there was the expectation and had it in policy that you had to communicate any changes in money laundering policy, any changes in compliance policy in the bank, any issues that might arise, or any incidents that occurred, so that people are aware and it doesn't happen. So they actually had that as some points that should be achieved and had it in policy. So when internal audit came, we used to look at minutes of staff meetings that they would have, or actually sit while they're doing a staff meeting, visit when they're doing a staff meeting to make sure they did it, right? So at all levels, there should be accountability and responsibility, specific functions, of course. So if I am the person dealing with onboarding clients, because it mightn't be compliance or MR, in most cases it's not, that is a specific function that would be high risk. People who do dealing with wires, any cash transfers, they should also have specific accountabilities and responsibilities, so they know this, these are the risks, and this is what you're responsible for doing. Outsourced functions. So this has been getting a lot of attention from central bank. I don't know about the other regulators, but actually for Securities Commission too. Someone mentioned to me, outsourcing is a big deal. So they're asking to see service level agreements. They want to see that in your policy you talk about outsource arrangements. Most people in their policy, they do not. They don't speak about it at all. They don't even have it as a topic on executive management or the board to say where are we with our covenants or any requirements on our outsourced functions. And you will be amazed how many things are outsourced today. And I talk about across industries. So you have in banking, financial services, of course, back office, mutual fund administration. You have for credit cards, they have call centers somewhere else. They have different types of customer assistance other places. Even helplines are not in the Bahamas. Helplines are in other countries. I worked in an accounting firm. Even review of audit files was done in India, other places in the Caribbean. So you're talking a lot of information leaving the Bahamas, coming back. You also have outsourced things like disaster recovery. So most large entities have a location outside the Bahamas that they send their staff to. that is an outsourced arrangement if it's not a part of your group. That you have to do some things to make sure that works. Anyone who has significant IT infrastructure have an outsourced arrangement so that you know we have access to the help desk. If everything crashes, if we have a cyber attack, what y'all doing? We can be first in the line, or y'all can put us in the back of the line because we're in the Caribbean and Latin America group, and we're not in Asia group, or we're not in US group. That is real. So you need to understand that because more and more compliance is being outsourced. So they do some of the background checking because in some cases they have the scale to and the funds and I know and like I say, I can speak about the accounting profession in particular. You have a small firm, they can't pay for World Check. It's expensive. All these things like Factiva, all these different sources to background check people, they use someone else, and so through that avenue, you have to, that other entity has information about your client, because they got to search them on your behalf. So you need a service level agreement around that to say that person is going to respect your confidentiality. You have the right at any point to walk on their premises and verify that they are maintaining the same level of due diligence as you would, especially with AML compliance in the private banking space. This is third party managers for sure, where they refer in clients, and you have to know if you just accept a client or you doing custody for them or banking for them, that they have performed the due diligence if you're not going to do it yourself, or you're going to take some of what they did. So you have to have some level of comfort around these outsourcing functions. So nowadays regulators will see it in the policy. They don't just want to know you doing something and that you have this agreement. And just in, like I said, in my experience, having to sit down and review that, sometimes those outsourced functions in the agreement, it says the entity is supposed to provide annual financial statements. The entity is supposed to give you their current policy on, say, cybersecurity. Nobody checking that. I telling you, ain't nobody checking that. That's not making money for me. I worry about these other things. I worry about this crisis, and sometimes in the wrong person's hand to oversee that. I've seen that go in IT hand, and that is not where it should be. That should be in someone who's dealing with risk, compliance, who can monitor it, but that is so critical, especially for, I would say, the Bahamas, because we outsource a whole heap of stuff. So you need to have that in policy. Of course, audit and compliance, that should be detailed, who they are, what they do, what their responsibilities are. And one of the important reasons that should be the case is that you don't need every question to come up in a department to come to compliance. That could be the negative when you don't make it clear. So instead of supervisor dealing with issues that within their purview, they sending everybody to compliance. And what compliance should be doing, they can't do because they dealing with all these other people's responsibilities. That happens. So this person have this little question, or where do I find this in policy because we had this customer and da da da. No, your supervisor should be able to answer that, not compliance. Compliance should be doing higher stuff than that, right? And we train everyone properly. And then all staff should know, as a staff member of this company, if I become aware, this is what I need to do. This is who I report to. This is, and if I don't do it, what's gonna happen? So you have who you're accountable to, accountable for, what your responsibilities are, and I don't have it there, but consequences if you don't do it. Okay, all of that should be in policy, so no one say, I didn't know. Because staff like to say that, oh, I didn't know, no one told me X, Y, Z. So that's why a lot of institutions like you to take exams and tests. They say, no, you did it. This is the policy you say you read. So, when we look at customer due diligence policy in particular, it should include guidance for these areas. What is simplified due diligence that is permitted? What lower standards are permitted? What exceptions to the procedures are permitted? There are always exceptions, always. And I say to people, exceptions are not bad if they're documented and supported and they make sense. New business acquisition, what are due diligence procedures around that? Okay, if we take over, the Bahamas has been going through this thing, especially in the private banking space, where one institution buying up the next one or taking over the clients of another entity. That is big because it don't mean who you buying. If you take over their clients, they're the same level of due diligence, and that could be a nightmare because you could be taking on, as they even say, a wasp nest and don't realize it and have to do all kind of cleanup. And they might have had poor relationships with their third parties, and now you walking into that and have to bring that to your standard. So it is important, even guidance around if we take on new business, or we acquire clients, acquire another business, this should be our due diligence procedures. We should have a team. The team will go assess. We will determine what we will accept, what we will reject. You need policy around that. Escalation, of course. So where you require enhanced due diligence, what does the escalation for that look like? So in your case, the case that you have, it might be a question of you requiring more information than the basic. And if you require more information than the basic, do you have to escalate that? Do you have to report that to anybody? Okay? Clients are not crazy. Clients talk to people all the time. Clients, sometimes that's how you get a client to referral, or you should open a client. They don't take long. They only ask you for this, and this. All of a sudden, that client comes to you, and you ask them for more than that person over there. And they say, well, why you need all this from me? Because they know what you asked Tom over there. And if you can articulate why they are different or why it is important to have it, they might get turned off that you doing something that is not appropriate. So it should be documented in policy. Higher risk clients, that should also be documented. Who are they? What is the profile for high risk client? How do we define it? Once we determine who's a high risk client, what do we do? So again, you have a client. If you risk profile them a certain way, somewhere you should be saying in our policy, it's saying this is how I should treat you. If you don't have a policy to tell you how you should treat them, then that's a gap. PEPs, of course, the definition for your institution, and the definition, of course, should be consistent with minimum guidance of the regulator or legislation or regulation, and then again, how you treat them. Do you monitor them more? Do you ask them more questions? Do they have to fill out another form everybody else don't have to fill out? How do they stop being PEPs? Are they PEPs forever? All that should be defined in your policy. Correspondent banking relationships, another hot topic. So there is guidance around that in the Bahamas in terms of in our regs. So that's an area that should be, whatever you have in your policy should be consistent, as well as any things that may pose a risk to your institution. You need to document and make sure it's in policy. Intermediaries and introducers, of course, a lot of people have referrals, third parties. You need rules around those people as well. If they approach us, what is our procedure? Do they have to go through a procedure to be approved? A lot of private banks have a process where, and they have it in policy, you have to be approved as an introducer for us. You have to be approved as an intermediary for us, and these are the requirements, and we assess that on an annual basis, and this is what the assessment looks like. And these are the people who would have to sign off for you to be on our list. Okay? So, of course, you should have that in policy, defining those things, and using a risk-based approach in terms of what you are going to ask to be done. So senior management. So for all this policy to work, procedures to happen, you need senior management to be committed to the policy. So their buy-in is required. If they don't buy into it, you will fail. And when I say buy-in, when things come to them, they don't bypass the process themselves. That really at the bottom line is what buy-in, or how I look at it in a practical way. If they could bypass you and they said, oh, the policy say we can't approve the client, and they come there and I approve it, I'm the president, the policy allow me exception, I approve it, I didn't look at any of the documents, I didn't consult compliance, I didn't ask them why. It's my friend, I don't know why y'all not putting them on our books, they should be here. That happens. And you have to make sure they are committed, they respect the policy, they respect the reason why we have it there, and they help to enforce it. So someone come to them, they said, did you check compliance? Did you consult them? Did they sign off? And if you can't say yes, well, you need to go to them first, and then they communicate with me, not you communicate with me directly. Because that is big issue, especially in our country, because we are oftentimes familiar and we feel like, well, it's my boy, I just can't ask them, I need this to be done now, I can't wait, compliances take too long, and I can't wait right now. And it happens. So the MLRO or compliance, they should also be playing an active role in making sure senior management is committed, because this is a two-way thing. Senior management will only be committed and think it's important if they are actually provided with timely information. They are provided with advice from time to time, so you should be given input. You should find out from them what their feedback is, if they have any questions, and you should ensure you are acting on any feedback that they give you. So if they tell you take too long to approve clients, you should be giving them feedback as to why. I don't have enough resources, I need more people, whatever it is. Because if we're not effective here, senior management, we're going to be exposed. And you saw we had this matter happen already. This is my plan to get it done. There should be an understanding of the legal and regulatory responsibilities. So I put that on compliance and MLRO. If they're sitting in the meeting, which they should be speaking to it. I've met a lot of people who sit in the chair of compliance MLRO, and you sit in a meeting and they don't open their mouth. They have to do a report, they provide the report, they put the report there. When the meeting go around, everyone read the report. Did y'all present your report? Yeah, they present it, they read it, put it down, and then that's it. And that's not effective. You really have to speak to management and say, this might be my report, but I'd like to highlight that these things have changed. For example, we had a change in our Financial Transaction Reporting Act in 2018. I've already done an assessment. This is the impact for our business. I think we need to consider these elements because it's going to impact the type of clients we take on, and the procedures we have now for new accounts will have to change. So that's what kind of interaction that should happen, not sometimes what I see where they say, well, they have a new Financial Transaction Reporting Act, I circulate it to everybody. We're not going to read it. And last thing, provide support. So if you want to be a trusted partner, you have to support the team, and you have to be part of the team. And you can't be in the corner doing what you do and, like they say, looking at new accounts, and that's it. You have to be a part of what decision making. If we deciding to, like in the last slide, we deciding to buy another business, you have a say. You have something that you could contribute based on the implications for compliance, implications for money laundering, and terrorism financing prevention. So you should always be providing support and input, and the more you do that, the more senior management will be committed, because they're going to feel like you're adding value. Your material talks about it a lot, that oftentimes compliance, the MLROs looked as a cost center, because I believe they don't properly articulate how they really add value. If I explain to a company how much that I might have prevented bad money coming in, reputational damage, the cost thereof, trust me, you add a lot of value. Because the cost to get an attorney to clean up, to go through court, the time to clean up something that should not have happened, plenty cost savings minimized from that process. When you have someone that gets through the door and you find out that, oh, we didn't ask these questions and we didn't ask that question, we shouldn't have, and that's part of your case too. The implications or consequences is that if we keep them, we gotta ask them now, and that's very uncomfortable, and that could show that maybe we're not competent, we're not equipped, and we could lose a customer, not necessarily that they're bad, we could lose them just by poor execution and not being guided properly by our policy, procedures, and structure. So I always tell people compliance adds a lot of value. It just have to be articulated to management properly. So some other things that management should be doing, they should ensure that all staff comply with policy and that is being monitored, any exceptions reported. So normally at the management level, you would want to see this in, if they have monthly management meetings, executive management, this should be an agenda item to say what is being done, what are the results of any monitoring, have there been exceptions, and what is being done to address it. And then for policy updates, this is something else that management should be behind to make sure policy is updated timely. And for changes, when you change the business, laws are changed, regulations, and staff. It's always amazed me how people could leave, new people could come, and our policy still have old people names in it, old references in it. They're not there anymore. And it's important even for staff to make sure that you have, the minute we promote someone, that's the other time when it happens, when you have changes in staff, people get promoted. Now you used to be in operations, now you are part of compliance team, and you might be the MLRO. We have to change, not just job description, we have to change policy if it referred to you by your name and say, you know, this lady is the compliance officer, MLRO. All that has to be changed. And the good thing is most policies now are automated. I know there's still a lot that are paper-based, but more and more automated, so it makes it easier to do updates. So you need to do it because it is the worst thing for a regulator to come and find old stuff. And then for you to come with that old story, yeah, someone was supposed to do it, it didn't happen, and we still talking about something, we don't even do it like that. But the policy was never updated to reflect what we're doing today. And people change the procedures and what is executed, but don't go back and say, does the policy even reflect what we're doing? And that is very common. So management plays a key role there, and it's important to make sure that is being done. And like the key word there is like timely. I could bet you, and I have some people from the regulator here, the Financial Transaction Reporting Act was updated, and I could bet you if you go into all institutions now, probably half of them don't have, and not even train the people to say this is what your responsibility is today, and that's significant, some of those changes. I could put money on that. So I don't know if anyone has any questions so far. So this is the last part we're going over now, implementing and communicating what the compliance arrangements are. So 3 ways that happens. Through our structure, resources of the AML CFT team, that impacts implementation and communication, annual plan, and handbook. So we're going to talk about each one of those so you get an idea of what they are. So when we talk about structure, we want to look, or we are looking at the structure of our compliance team and the resources and considerations that we have to make when it comes to our AML, what I call the prevention team, really. And the structure becomes important because we have to make sure that we have a team that could actually respond to the firm objectives. There's no point having this huge company and we have one person there to respond to the objectives. That isn't the right structure. Maybe we need to have 5 people, one person dealing with customer due diligence, one person dealing with general compliance, maybe a risk officer, and maybe 2 support team members to do the administrative communication and all that type of work. Okay? So you have to make sure that the structure of the compliance team is appropriate to the mandate of the entity. Compliance risk, so based on the risks that you actually face, if you face a lot of risks because of your client base, because of the products you offer, again, you need to make sure the structure is appropriate. I can't have persons there who don't understand the business, don't know how to sell, don't know what we sell, how we sell it, the type of clients we have sitting in that chair, they don't understand the risk. Okay, we have documents in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and we have this person doing compliance, and that is 50% of our client base. We have risk just because they're global people, and if you don't have sensitivity for that, or your team doesn't, it's not going to be able to respond. Regulator requirements. So the regulator is also going to say, because of your size and scale, you can have one person there. That's impossible. And I've seen that. I've seen it where there are institutions that had someone as internal audit and compliance, and the regulator said no. For your size and scale, you need a different person to do compliance and a different person to do internal audit. That is not going to work. Okay? I've seen it where they have the person who's compliance is also dealing with clients. And I talk about onboarding clients, like relationship manager. Okay? No. Entities do what they could get away with in some cases, because they will say, well, we don't have the money to spend a whole person doing compliance, and what they can be doing the rest of the time, because in their mind, the only thing you're doing is dealing with new clients, right? So the regulator in a lot of cases is going to step into this conversation and say, no, based on the risks you pose to even our financial sector because of what you're doing, you need to have the team structured in a different way and a different structure for your compliance. And all of this should be documented and communicated to staff. And of course, at the different levels of documentation and communication will be different, but it should be documented. What the team looks like, what their responsibilities should be, and who is responsible for what. On the other side of this is resources. So time, money, and personnel. So I can't have the person who's head of compliance and MLRO working on a project for 50% of the year with the president or the managing director on a special project, and then I expect my compliance thing to be done properly. That's impossible. Okay? That happens. I need you to work on me with the special report because we got to do this thing for Central Bank, and they want us to have this presentation, and this can take a couple months for us to do, but you still have responsibilities to do your monitoring, oversight, making sure, all those things that the policy document now that you need to do. So you need the time, or your team needs to have the time. If you have a court matter, which happens sometime, the amount of time you gotta put in to prepare for a court matter, especially if you're in the banking space, you need to make sure that the day-to-day is still happening while you're dealing with that, right? And that's a big thing. Money, of course, so when you don't make money in an institution, they, don't give you plenty money back. So to them, if you're a cost center, sometimes it has to be a big argument with money. But you have to make a case so that you get adequate financial resourcing. So you need money to pay for training, you need money for technology to do the reviews, to do the reports, to do the oversight, and then of course the personnel. Good people cost money. Good people aren't cheap. So you need to be able to pay for the staff members who will be competent, who will be able to execute. Okay. So the other part, most entities have an annual plan. So for AML CFT, and this really guides activities of the function. So the plan will say what we plan to do this year. The plan normally requires board approval or executive management approval to say yes, this is where we're going to be spending our hours. And it should focus on the key priorities and risks and be risk-based. So what are the areas should be the key focus? You can always still have standing areas you have to do every year. You always have to do training, always monitoring. You're going to do some testing, but you want to show them where your focus will be and what are the key priorities for the entity. And that plan should explain the approach, identify any issues, resources, as well as speak to target dates. So if you have a plan, management should have expectations as to when we get updates. This should be completed. These other things should be completed. If you're doing reviews, this when it should be done. If we have court matters out there, what is the status? Okay, if we have an inspection coming up, are we prepared? What have we put in place? If we change in policy, we go into a new system. Compliance is normally involved in that. These things are projected at least a year or so in advance when you're making system upgrades. It normally impacts policy, procedure, and compliance as well. That's something compliance may put in their plan. We are going to be involved in this new transition project to move this paper-based activity to automated activity, and we have to walk through all the procedures, and we have dedicated 2 months to do that with the team. So all that should be in a plan, and that should be outlined so that it could be approved and the adequate resources could be put behind it. And then lastly, a handbook. Not everyone has a handbook, but most entities I see putting it in place. Some key things, one I don't have on the slide, but they have in your material. Do not take something off the shelf and just use it. it's important to tailor whatever, even if you get off the shelf, tailor it to your institution. But handbooks are useful in communicating procedures to employees, and something easy to follow. They can flip through frequently asked questions. What do I do in this particular situation? So that's where the practical application comes into play. It should be required reading for new hires. So when you on board, someone should, and I think this is the ideal, someone should talk it through. This is where the handbook is. These are the key elements you gotta look at. And make sure they have understanding as well as the existing staff. You do a refresher, make sure everyone is aware. It should be easily accessible and easy to update. So it being automated in soft copy form is usually good for that, because you could just go in, update it, send a note to all the staff, just so you're aware we have updated the policy for this particular thing, the handbook for this particular element. Be aware, make sure that you adhere to it and you review. That is the handbook. So lastly, when we doing policy, we talked about these issues before, one or two of them, but just other considerations, outsourcing in our policy. So this is at the level of, and I'd say at a higher level, whether we're going to, we have to think about whether we are delegating a function versus responsibility. So whenever we do outsourcing, we should be delegating a function, not responsibility. Responsibility also always remains with us. At the end of the day, whoever doing work for us, we still should be reviewing, we should be looking at it, making sure we're happy with what we get, because it belongs to us. It does not belong to them. We can't blame them. We are going to be the owners of whatever is produced. And the compliance needs to monitor those relationships and risk. They have to monitor it. I know institution, it is always amazing to me, like just through evolution, what happens, you start off good and then something goes off. This entity had outsourced the HR salaries and everything else to be done by external company, and it was a company, and the company ended up going defunct, but they continued to use the programmer, the person who actually wrote the software was continued with the entity to support the program, so they continued to use it. So I remember asking questions about it, and I said, so again, does this lady have a business? Like, does she have an office or something? Because she's in another country. Oh no, she does this out of her house. So if they have a snow day or something, sometimes we can't get to her because the communication is bad. And I was like, what? And I said, okay, so how many people, if she mess up now, how many salaries and benefit information y'all have at rest? And it's like a couple hundred. And I was like, really? And they said, yeah, but she's reliable. We know her for a long time, blah, blah, blah. So again, you got to monitor that stuff, because it might have been good today when you had a whole entity and stuff behind you, but things change so quickly that you don't know who it could be in a year or two. And if you don't monitor it, you're not in a position to make those transitional decisions on a timely basis. To say, no, we don't want to do it like this. We need to start a search now for a different vendor to support us, because there's too much at risk. But it happens. Issues and breaches, reporting. So this, of course, should be another thing that should be documented in policy. It should be clear. The process should be clearly documented and communicated, because the thing we don't want to happen is, when it comes to whistleblowing, to make sure that we do not inadvertently tip off the customer. So in policy, it should speak to whistleblowing in particular, what that is, and as well as when to report directly to the regulator and external authority. Because people do it anyway. When they're upset and angry, they get fired. Sometimes they go to regulator and say XYZ happening over there, you'll need to investigate them. But you need to, for staff, you need to communicate these things so they do it the right way. There may be instances where you have to go outside the normal channels, but that should also be documented and explained to staff. Record keeping, so another big topic. Retention and destruction. We have laws in the Bahamas around this. And there are special considerations for customer due diligence documentation. Let me say that again, because people think that 3 years, 7 years, all those rules. Customer due diligence documentation is different, because when a customer is with you, they live. And when someone closes an account versus closing a relationship, that's two different things. And I've seen with destruction, people destroy things that should not have been destroyed because that relationship is still alive. And the account might be dead, that one, but the whole relationship is still alive. So this is, to me, has become a little more complicated, and you definitely need policy so people understand this document. You need to keep these type of documents, and you keep them for this period. These are the type you need to destroy. They have the destruction date, the process. And of course, with destruction, you don't want to keep something longer, because if you have it there, someone find it, you have liability. So the minute that reaches destruction date, you destroy it right away. Most companies have strong controls around that, because people destroy things they're not supposed to destroy, and then they keep in the other direction. People take things out of archiving, and no one knows where it is. So now companies have very strict rules around documents, document retrieval, document maintenance. Fit and proper. So our regulator has guidance around fit and proper requirements for senior management, compliance, internal audit. I think if you serve in any officer executive position, there are certain expectations. The reason some people even doing this course, because you need to have certain paper to be the compliance MLRO. So the policy should speak to that, and it should speak to requirements in terms of integrity, honesty, financial soundness. So you shouldn't be bankrupt in certain positions. And normally that is put in the category of ethics. So most companies have ethics training now, and it's put at the top of, okay, you need to sign off on a disclosure to say all these things I am compliant and I adhere to. So there are expectations around this, and this should also be in policy. And then lastly, training and competency requirements. So the policy should speak to what training is required when you're a new hire in obtaining any competency. So if you go in a new role, sometimes the policy will speak to, for this role, these things are required, and maintaining, enhancing competence. So this is the ongoing training, the CPE, continued professional development that is required, and then supervision requirements. So training there as well. So policy could speak to all these things, and it's good to put in policy, because normally HR should be the one around this one to make sure it's happening. And usually when people do performance appraisals and they go through that process, that's where companies normally confirm or check that. Right? So that is the end of Unit 13, sorry. So we now can talk about your question, your assignment 2. So you have 3 parts to this question. So first thing is, and I did it to the max, so you have 3,500 words max. So the 3 questions generally around the same points, 30, 35, 35, something like that. So it's generally about the same amount of words. So it'll be like about 1,150 words. You're doing, what's that, like 3-4 pages? Or more double space? Because it's double. I mean, so so it should be probably equal for each question which you're actually gonna write. So some characteristics when I read this, read about this client and this company. So of course you have to define who you are, but they tell you some things that you can waver on. They say that your firm is large, so you can't pick a small place. They tell you that you're regulated, so you have to be under a regulator in the Bahamas. You gotta have someone, Securities Commission, compliance, or central bank. The other thing that, of course, you choose jurisdiction, so I wouldn't pick somewhere outside the Bahamas. And they say something else that I thought was key was that you were introduced to the client by the business development manager, which means a business development manager, by mere definition, is a salesperson. So they don't care about due diligence. They may be aware because all that training that should happen, but their priority is sales, right? Building the business, developing the business. So it shouldn't be any big reliance on them seeking out someone that is totally compliant. They're seeking out someone who have a lot of money and build up their book. Their priority and your priority are going to be different. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind. And this particular client is opening not one account, a series of accounts. They're interested in investment products, so that might suggest they're sophisticated. They're not someone, you need to explain products. They have some knowledge. And the other thing that I thought was critical, that you actually met the customer. A lot of companies that are large, regulated, in a lot of cases you don't actually meet the customer, but you met the customer and you interviewed them. You were the person, which I thought was critical. Yeah?
So you actually met them?
Yeah, it says that you conducted the initial interview, yeah.
I mean, could have been done over the phone.
Doesn't matter. There are a lot of institutions, I'm sure people here could say, you never talk to the customer. It's just paper. You get the paper, you get the ID. You have the option to speak to them if you desire. But in a lot of cases, you don't interact with the customer at all, right? Normally it's that same business development manager and it's stopped there. And then if required, then it might be someone else. So I thought that was interesting that you actually spoke to the client and was able to do the interview. So,
What was your feedback in reference to them opening a series of accounts?
I felt like that was important because it suggested to me this person is like really brand new. There are people that you deal with sometimes through another location, and people that might have had a small account with you or have done business with you in the past. But it just suggested to me that they like really brand new and that they are embarking on doing big business with you. Some entities will say, or some persons will say, I open in an account and I can see how you do with it, like one or two, right? And I keep my other investment account before I move my whole portfolio. But when you're doing a series, it just suggested to me that they move in a serious book of business to you. Now, that might not be the case, but when it says series, that means, at least for me, that this might be a huge book of business. And definitely be pressure to, open it. Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Fees as well. Because investment accounts attract higher fees than just having accounts sitting there with assets in it. Because you can get commissions, on trades, you get funds from giving investment advice, and then just based on the assets under management, you could collect a fee. So, a lot of earning potential from a client like this. So, that's just step back. Like I said, the characteristics of the firm, as well as some things that I just noted in the information before I got to the interview part that I felt may impact what happens later. So the first part, question 1. So I want you to know, like when I reviewed this, I took it from point, I don't want to tell you what to do and how to do, but just some things to think about in terms of your approach. So they said, what would your initial risk rating of the accounts of Emmanuel Santos? Explain your rationale and the consequences of your initial risk rating. So the first thing I said, it's important, first of all, to state what your risk rating is. Because some people will answer this question and forget they should even state what the risk rating is.
I thought you would have put it at the conclusion as to at the end of it.
I think you should say. Yeah. Because trust me, you don't want no one. I can say to you as a grader and someone who has graded. Yeah. Because trust me, you don't want to dig through as a grader to say, where is this? Right? You want them to know that this is based on the interview, facts presented, our initial risk rating is X. And then you explain why, right? So I think you should state the risk rating. Make it clear, whatever. Your company, and this is my point here, your company should have some sort of scale. Maybe you place this in a table for efficiency, but you should have some scale as to, I picked low risk, because our company has a scale and this low risk, and it has some definitions as to what low risk is. Medium, high risk. So you have in a snapshot what the basics of what your company's risk rating criteria as definitions is made of. So that'd be like your policy or whatever guidance. Of course, you can explain, but that would be a segue to see how complex or simplified your company's approach is. If I said that, if I showed someone a scale and I said low, medium, high, then they have a picture of where I place in this person if I say medium risk, right? If I say my scale has 5 elements to it, so I have low, medium, high, and then high, that's different. And the reason people have the in-between ones is they have a basis to promote you or demote you. So if I have, like, say, medium, I say I rate this person as medium risk. Then, based on additional information, I may upgrade them to high. And if I have a wider scale to medium high, that means I'll do some additional due diligence, but not as much as high, because they haven't shown me anything to say they crossed the line. But it's so close to the line that I got to do some elements of high and some elements of medium. So I think having some sort of scale is going to be important, but you don't need to go in a deep dive as to your scale. I think if you have some sort of appendices or like a little diagram or something embedded, a little table, so that it could be clear and you could more speak precisely to your rating, but they could have perspective. So that was what I was thinking there. So, and I put this, to me, this question of 3 parts. I say to people all the time, when you have any question, small or large, you should have an outline or a plan. If you don't use a plan, you should think about it. So this is kind of a plan I started thinking about when I saw just this piece. Because you want to break it down into bits to make it easier to complete the question. So the second part I have is explain your rationale. So that's why. Why did I say this, the risk? Why? What factors influence me to cause me to get to my why? What is things like, what is my business risk appetite? There are things that are going to cause me to go to why, not just based on what they present, but also based on my company's risk appetite. If my company is not used to dealing with someone like this, then I might rate them higher, and that's why my rationale might be high risk. If my company is used to dealing with complex, sophisticated people, persons with that type of background, then I could maybe get away with medium or low, right? With the qualification that with additional information that I could, I feel satisfied. We have a similar portfolio of these clients. This is how we manage them because we used to working in these markets. But that's how you describe yourself, right? So it's important to think about you as a business as well as that client and how they're presenting themselves. Because those two got to mesh to make sense for why you risk rating in a particular way. So that was the second part of one. So the third part, they say, and the consequences of your initial risk rating. So when I think about consequences, the minute I say you are low, then what does my policy say about that? Because my policy can tell me I got to do A, B, C, or D. Regulations are going to say I do A, B, C, or D, right? If I said that person is high, regulations can tell me I should be doing A, B, C, or D. The law says I should be doing A, B, C, or D. And my policy should be saying A, B, C, or D if I say high, right? My onboarding will look different depending on my risk profile. Because if I deem initially that you high, then I am going to have enhanced due diligence and require these 5 more documents. So my onboarding will look different if my initial rating, and most of you would experience this if you go to a bank here in Nassau and try and open an account. If you are a PEP or if you are considered a high-risk person, they will not open your account that day. They will tell you, come back. If you are a company, they'll tell you, they'll say you need these documents, this resolution, and 9 times out of 10 they can tell you come back. They're not going to open it that day, right? Now, if you present yourself as a salaried person, and that person get work for government, they've been working there 20 years, they like close to 60, they'll open that right then, because they consider low risk. Small balance, small amount, onboarding could look way different, right? So that's a consequence of your risk rating. That's at least one consequence. Also setting up the profile. So if I set up a profile for this person, it could mean that I need to watch them all the time. Or I need to put them on hold if I don't onboard them today. Then I need to set up the profile where I block in certain things from them doing until we are satisfied about X, right? They can operate this account, and all of that should be somewhere in your policy, or you should be speaking to it from a policy standpoint. And then the last thing is the ongoing monitoring that to me, a consequence of the ongoing monitoring, because if I set you up as high from the beginning, I know I have to do a whole heap of monitoring. I have to do some additional checks. May have to do global searches and do them like every quarter or every 6 months just to make sure I'm satisfied. So that's just to guide you, and not say that's it, but that's to guide you, and it is a consequence. There are implications depending on which one you pick. Generally across clients, there are things that you need to do that you should speak to, but based on the rating, we'll add that other layer of these are the other must-dos, because our policy or procedures or law of the Bahamas or best practice says we should be doing this, or we had different issues that happen in our jurisdiction that were similar to this one, or examples where this presented that caused us to say these also, we're going to do this for this client. And you may have examples in your company or incidents that happen globally where this was best practice. All right, so they are consequences of, okay, I give you this rating, what's going to happen? Okay, so there's some other things. I had an initial risk rating, right? Just going into that part a little deeper. Notice I ain't going to question part 2 yet, right? So these are some questions to consider when you're thinking about the initial risk rating. And you have to document your rationale, right? And yeah, you can talk about policy. So they talk about nationality and this problem. Are there any risky or corrupt countries in the ones they listed? Right? So you got to make sure you don't just say it's risky, you got to have a basis. If you go to Transparency International or one of those websites that have the index, you could measure it and say, our policy says that if you are on that Transparency International list and your index is above this number, then you are high risk for us by definition. Okay? So is there one citizenship or multiple? So he's Mexican with residences in the US, Mexico, and Colombia. So does he have multiple citizenship? That's a legit question. Because I know people with multiple passports, right? Where's your country of residence? Your main country. Because whatever's your main country is where you're going to have most of your liability and reporting. Sanction list, so that's a consideration. This person, that could be a positive. There are no countries on sanction list, so I don't have to rate them high. Or they're not someone I need to reject. So don't just look at it as the reasons why I rate you high. It could be a justification why I rate you low. Because you don't present this, you don't present that. So you tick off in a positive way, you're not on this list. And are these countries those you are comfortable with? So that really what I'm speaking to is a business. I don't know what your business is. I don't know what your profile is a business. You might only operate in Latin America. You might only operate in Europe. I don't know. But based on your business and who you're comfortable with, this might be a problem jurisdictionally. Okay? It might be an issue jurisdictionally because there are laws, regulations, and infrastructure. Okay? So business interests. They talk about shareholding an ABC company incorporated in the state of Delaware. So everybody know Delaware allow bearer shares, right? So that might be a question. What type of entities you have? Is the beneficial ownership clear given the structures you have? Are the activities high risk and easy to verify? When you have corporate interest in a pharmaceutical in Texas might not be hard to verify because you could get state records, they have to file taxes, all them things. Certain things are publicly known. That's a good thing with the U.S. You could find anything. When you get into like Latin America, okay, Latin America is a big place. Which country? Costa Rica, Nicaragua. Which country is it, right? Because it could be on a sanction list. It could be embargo list, one of those things. Land holding in Mexico. So, do they have a land registry? Is it easy to independently verify? So that's some things to consider, some questions to ask. Source of wealth and source of funds. The things there, is this enough information for you to be satisfied as to the source of wealth and source of funds? In terms of the source of funds, and they talk about offshore corporate accounts in the Cayman Islands, that could be good, that could be bad. It just depends on, one, is it enough, and being able to verify. Okay, so they are just some questions I thought that you would want to consider, and the answers to them might be help document why you picked your initial risk rating, because I couldn't verify, it wasn't easily understood. They have multiple citizenships. You have to confirm which is the country where they domicile most of the time, or they choose to tax report, right? So part 2, customer due diligence support team wish to make further inquiries about the potential client prior to onboarding. What information would you expect them to obtain, and how might it be acquired? So based on question 1, how you respond to that, I would say that it would tell you where there are gaps. Okay? Because if in question 1 you said, I rate them this because they didn't have enough information, well then already there's a concern that there is a gap. Okay? What would be sufficient to obtain to satisfy the team? So it's important to understand as well what information that, if you got it, right, would be able to satisfy you. And they say here, what information would you expect them to obtain and how it might be required? So what you would expect them to obtain will be dictated by regulations, laws, best practice, your policy and your risk appetite, and the knowledge that if you get things from independent sources is always better, right? So that will help you with what is the expectation and how it might be acquired. Again, you always want to look at things that are readily available from independent sources. I don't like to, you want sources that you don't have to go back to the client and ask them, because the client going to give you things you may not even be able to verify the accuracy of it, and the more independent it could be, the better. So like how they said with the land holding in Mexico, so if their land registry is something that might be public information listed online, you could go online and you could look at it. Same way with shareholdings in the US. Oftentimes you have registries that are public and you could go and see who this person is, and it might be easy to verify. As well as you could request from a client certain corporate documentation, certificate of good standing. There are attorneys where you could get independent confirmation who are your attorneys who set up these companies. We could send request to them just to confirm that you do have these interests, X, Y, Z. If you have a banker, in these countries, some people get a banking reference letter, especially if it's a large reputable institution like Chase, Bank America. That is the independent source that could verify the wealth, definitely, or the funds. And again, you may have other entities in that region that you do business with or you feel comfortable with, and you could get information through the same interview and conversations to say, are you aware of this person? If they are this significant in terms of their business practices, they should be known to other people. People with money know other people with money. So sometimes that's a way to at least confirm some of the information, people in the business community, etc. But again, I think that you have to lead the way with what your regs and laws expect you to have, because if they inspect you, I need to have this in place. And your policy and risk appetite, which you're comfortable with. And then go from there. And then the last part, if you decided to onboard Santos as a client, but after 12 months, further information came to light that confirmed he was a criminal and was laundering the proceeds of crime, what consequences might result for the firm? So again, you go back to laws and regulations. And your policy should incorporate this anyway, but you go back to laws and regulations. First thing, do I need to file SCR? And I'm thinking, if you find that out, you need to, the minute you become aware. Do I exit this client? That's the next piece. And you had that earlier in your studies, exiting clients and how you do it and what are the implications. Consider legal, reputational risk and who you need to report to internally. So this becomes damage control when you find out, because they're already on your books. So you should be reporting and informing senior management and the board right away. That's why I say report to, because you have the company, you know your structure, and these are some of the risks that you need to speak to. What are the risks we face given that this has occurred, this person is on our books? What sanctions, what penalties, what exposure do we have? Right? You need to be able to inform your team. Like I said, the sanctions, you have to consider any sanctions. And then you need to look at gaps, any policy issues, breaches, do an investigation, do a report. Sometimes there are red flags, we ignore them. And this might be something that results as a result of this occurring, because there's a breakdown somewhere and we have to understand where it is. So that might be that might be the result, because if the regulator walked in because of this, they'll say, well, what has been your response? And you should at least demonstrate, we did internal investigation, we tried to understand why this happened, we did everything as we should have, this is something beyond us, or we did investigation, someone dropped the ball or whatever, we dealt with it with disciplinary action, increased oversight, we have enhanced due diligence over this area, something, right? If you find out something bad. But I think that some of these would be some of the things you need to be talking about when you have something, a breach that actually occurs. Yeah? So I don't know if you have any further questions. They were my thoughts on that.
I have a question when it comes to the first one.
Okay.
In your opinion, how do you, I guess, combine the products and the services? How would you how vulnerable would the products and the services be to give to this client? Like how, I understand
this part will be discussed, and I understand this, but I'm looking at how can you match it in to make it flow, or am I overthinking it and I don't need to?
But they gave you information, and again, it's how you use the information that's given. So they said this person interested in opening a series of accounts and utilizing some of the firm's investment products. So it doesn't sound like they're utilizing all, they can utilize some of the investment products. Now, the good thing is that your products would have already been vetted, gone through whatever process to say these meet our standards and requirements, right? Be comfortable in terms of risk exposure. We have a risk appetite for these products. When you have a client that is going to do their own investing now and have discretion, so that's a discretionary account, they're not going to be managed by you. They may be doing what they want. You may have some limitations on where they go in with their money, right? Because if they have funds and all the funds are not going to be utilized in your accounts, you need to ask the question, what you going to be doing with this other money? Are you going to be investing on your own? Are you going to be paying people and doing transfers? I know sometimes companies will say we're using this as a holding company and we pay the corporate bills of all our underlying companies. So you have to understand, again, just like any due diligence, what is going to be the activity in these accounts. Why do you need, some institutions have a limit. You can only open 5 accounts, or you can only open 4, but you need to know purpose. What is going to be the purpose of the account? If they only can invest in some, what is going to be the purpose of the other some? Right? So that's a question maybe you have to ask them, because they have all these diverse activities, from farm to Delaware company. So you will understand what is, what is your business objective? You come into us, we do investments here, great. But what is your purpose with these other funds? Do you plan over time to invest more? What is your plan? Because you want to make sure you're good with what they come into you to do. So that might be an opportunity. I look at that sentence as an opportunity to say, let me understand what your purpose of opening this account is. When you go to the bank, they ask you that. What's your purpose? So that question might be an opportunity to say, this is somewhere else we need to get additional information. I might not be comfortable because they're not using all the funds to invest in our funds. If they did that, then I think that's a higher degree of comfort. 90% of the funds are going to be used to invest in our funds. That isn't what they said. They said only some.
I think it's also going to be important to know which sector you're relying on. Because if you were saying I'm in the banking or securities, that would be important to say how you rely on it. Or if you're saying I'm in a law firm or...
No, but I mean, you could have...
products.
But see, the fact that they invested in your products gives you higher comfort because your products are vetted and you know your products, right? And you know that's the indication that you have investment products as part of your portfolio, right? So you are this large regulated firm, and the fact that they say you're utilizing some of the firm's investment products however you define yourself, you have investment products. That's what they tell you in this case.
That's what I'm saying to her, that how she responds will depend on the product or which sector she's relying on.
Well, I don't know if it matters the type of products. I think the fact that it's yours gives you more strength because that means you control how they're done and regulated. You don't want to make your company questionable. You want to demonstrate that you're strong, mature, well-regulated, right? Because they say you're a regulated firm. You want to show more weakness in the client more than show weakness in you. Because you want the focus to be on this client. So it's more as to if you don't do it our way, what you doing? What you doing with the rest of our money? You see? So I think that's an opportunity to talk about purpose of the activity. Because then you will know frequency of transactions. If I invest in products, that's long haul investment. If That's six, they ask you what your investment objectives are, especially when you invest in funds, you don't go in, come out right away. If you have loose cash, what you doing with that? What is gonna be your purpose? How many transactions you plan to do? What is the size of those transactions you planning to do? They don't say any of that. So with that extra cash or things they open it, what you need it for? I'd want to know why. So at least if I put in my profile, I could be able to say, this is what I expect you to be doing over this account, and I can manage you within that profile. That's why in the slide I had before, you want to be able to set up the initial profile. Because what is that going to be? So you want to know that if this is a low risk, I don't really, my profile can be simple, but if I say it's high risk, I really need to know what you're doing with your funds. I'm going to have transactions over 10,000 coming through. Are you going to bring over all the money today? Like, what are you going to be doing? Any other questions?
I was thinking, because they specifically set out the position in which we hold in the transaction as relationship manager, do we need to expand greatly on the role of that person in the organization? And what level of seniority they would have in that organization to the extent of their responsibility?
You can to give a framework and perspective for the reader, so they could understand who that person is in the organization and your reporting lines. Because you want to be clear as to, just how we said in policy, where your responsibility begins and ends. So I don't think that is harmful. I think you just have to make sure within that context and the words that you are allowed to have, you are measured in how deep you go, but give enough that they get a picture that I'm relationship manager. I do have responsibility for compliance to a certain extent. And before I go to the MLRO or the head of compliance, these would be my concerns. Right. Now, if it's not within your portfolio and you have to pass it on, I think that kind of eliminate a lot of the analysis they're asking you to do, right? Because then that wouldn't be in your purview. But clearly, if this is supposed to be in the purview of this person, and a part of their responsibilities to do an initial assessment. Like I was saying during the class, oftentimes this compliance in MLRO, you may not you may not be involved in every account that's open every day, and they onboarding these people, and really this is part of escalation as well. So there's also that in the policy, that consequences could be escalation, that you can't handle this particular the client. But I think again it goes back to policy, right? You have a scale, and you also what does the policy require? So if you have a policy and it's consistent with the laws, regulations, all of that, and it's already embedded, then the policy will say to accept this client, if they have all these things, if they have this, and this, you rate them this, and you accept them. And then you pass it on. If they're rated high, it gets passed on to compliance, because compliance have to sign off. Right? Now, if that isn't clear, then that's a gap in your policy. So where you go to this next part of the question, where the additional information, this is where you find gaps. So if I compare, I do initial rating and I realize, and I compare to what the policy say we need, then I can be like, I can't send it to compliance because they gonna ask me for this. So I need to get A, B, C, and D, before we could finish this onboarding process of this new client. And we have to get this information from them, because this wouldn't be acceptable for us to get them to accept this client. So that's policy, and policy should reflect the laws, regulations, all that stuff. But the relationship manager, normally it's a senior role. The things that might be important from that perspective is that you have in central bank guidelines, from my recollection, specific requirements for that person in terms of training, education. So there is expectation that they would have received a higher level of training and education in terms of AML, CTF prevention. There is that expectation. If you want to state that, that's fine. And in terms of where they are, in terms of your background and what you have been exposed to, and you know when the policy says, and training that has been mandated by your regulator has been received, XYZ. So you are aware that these things are needed and required, and what your reporting responsibility is as the front line, because you're the front line. So from that perspective, you could speak about it, but I would say be very targeted so you don't go off course and lose focus on what they're actually asking you in the question. I find it's good to answer specifically what they ask you, then add the layers on top. Any other questions?
Me again.
Yeah.
So, when it comes to the series of accounts, should you specifically put in which accounts they
If you feel it's useful to do so, I think this could be answered without having to get into the details of specific accounts. I think it's more important to understand the purpose of why they need a series of accounts more than what those accounts look like. Because to me that's a gap, and they need the questions where you need additional information. Because how do you profile this person? How do you measure what is going to happen across this account? You don't have, I don't know if you have enough information to do that. See, I think what they're trying to get at really to see your understanding of, it's good to have policy, it's good to understand risk, but there's a actual application of how can we take this person on, and there's someone that someone would take on, It's just about you making sure that they jump over all the hoops. So some are okay, and some they could jump over. Some you need to know what questions to ask and how to get past those goalposts in terms of your family money. How do I verify that? Now, if all their family money was going through Chase Bank from when Chase began, you win. But if it hasn't, and it was some local bank or BCCI or somewhere else, then okay, we might have a problem. Okay? So it's just knowing the questions to ask, and making sure that at the end of the day you are satisfied and your company is protected. It's like when we talk about the policy, at the end of the day, the goal is, are we protected against money laundering and terrorism financing? Because we want to be well regulated, and we would want to be seen to be that way. And have we achieved that goal based on the work we did around this client? Would we still be protected? Or are we opening ourselves up to increased risk of money laundering, terrorism financing? Because this is risk. So that's why I threw in there the risk appetite. What's our appetite? Any other questions? So I hope that was helpful. Yeah. So This happens in real life. I'm sure all those who are in the business know this. Anyone who didn't sign, that's the sheet there to sign.
I think it's all bands and down.
I don't know how practical that is, because you only have parents. Right. Where they're right. No problem. No problem. I think this makes sense. Because then you would have to focus like on each individual account and then have to take them out of the way. So I'll reach out to you.
5,000 words.
I was focusing on the difference. Like, I think that that's just because geography,
Right. Yeah.
And then
I
it's
think that's the other factor. Yeah.
So, you back to
But
work?
my thing was, I didn't
You
initially
feel better?
put my
I'm trying to stay there.
because I thought,
Hey, I'm staying there.
come to that.
Because last week I
My
was
first
they
sentence I
always
hear,
kept coming out.
they don't put it right
Oh, I'm
there.
not gonna
They
be
may
able
not.
to-
Okay, I'll talk to
Yeah,
you.
but I keep up on WhatsApp
Okay,
because I
alright.
have to check this first like the radio reasons. I told them that Thursdays is bad because I have like private rehearsal.
Right, okay,
So any other day,
right.
Tuesday's bad too because I have another function of that on Tuesdays. But
Did you come to finish your first assignment? You had it? How was it?
I'm going like to look at the
Okay.
I mean, you also your own?
Yeah.
It was okay?
I know you did.
Like that? We're doing it.
Because what happened is I didn't come.
Close associates.
So
Same
anything like that.
Okay.
And they gave me, they gave me.
I can see you. Good luck.
Excuse
me, sir. No, I have to go check mine just to make sure.
That's no worries. That's how I used to be. Focus on this one right now.
Okay, right.
Focus on this.
Listen, my thing is if I'm
This
giving
one,
you
I
minutes,
got that.
They're done.
if I'm
Okay.
giving you
Well, thank you for telling me that
it was
because
like,
I so much up and down. I say, you know what, I'll check it at some point, but I need to check it because I know how to grade mine either.
Right.
You know?
Mine was rushed.
So long because I was reading all these different
Right.
a lot
It
of
was in the second one
But
and all the
I
others.
said, I got penalized for my work.
So I need to lock
I
myself
was
in.
60,050.
Oh, no. Make sure I'm doing
I got
it this
penalized
time.
for my work.
So
I knew
they were
because
like really,
it was my time. I even had a lot of trials. So I didn't really decide what time I got
it is, that's what I said. Yeah, but I
I left a lot of
Yeah.
the work is there.
because of my
Like that because I really want it.
So I things that I wanted to put in.
As the
I just made it put one side of
that's what they said in the meeting, but the word
they might just say,
yeah,
okay,
they said
they'll
that
give
we
me
need
a
I didn't wanna take the risk.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
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 Yeah, I
But,
was like,
I'll stay in
so
touch.
once I
Okay.
wrote my first draft, I then went back and I just started cutting. Cause I realized a lot of times, I think because of training, yeah, you can edit it and
Okay,
then
let's fill this up, but I'll message you.
things that
Yeah,
aren't,
please
they don't
do.
answer the question, but it just sounds
Let's
good.
see.
So I have to
Yeah.
take all,
I'm gonna go in
all
on
that.
that.
I
Finish getting that sorted out. Okay.
Yeah, I was
Is
surprised.
this still recorded?
I don't know.
Because we were having a big conversation up there. I hope not.